Welcome to the 429th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome back to COVID calls STS researcher and filmmaker SULFIKAR AMIR. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID calls live on Twitter and also on the COVID calls YouTube channel. You can hear COVID calls anytime recorded as podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And as always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of February 24th, 2022, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center, the nation of Indonesia is reporting 147,025 deaths from COVID-19. Malaysia reports 32,488 lives lost to the disease, and Singapore reports 963 deaths to COVID-19. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic. I'd like to continue that now. Headline, Kety Herawati Sultana, tireless Indonesian physician, dies at 60. This was written by Richard C. Paddock and Muktita Suhartono and appeared April 23, 2020 in the New York Times. A senior doctor at Medistra Hospital in Jakarta, Kety Herawati Sultana was known as a tireless physician who would treat anyone without regard for her own welfare. When Indonesia's transportation minister, Budi Karya Samadi, arrived at the hospital in mid-March with what appeared to be typhoid, she was part of the team that treated him. His illness instead turned out to be one of Indonesia's early cases of the new coronavirus. Dr. Kety and several other staff members soon contracted the virus themselves, although its origin was never pinpointed. She died on April 3rd, 2020 at the hospital, said her daughter, Dr. Margareta Octaviani. She was 60. The death of Dr. Kety, who spent her career at Medistra Hospital as a general practitioner, highlighted concerns about the risks for medical personnel treating coronavirus patients in Indonesia, where personal protective equipment has been limited. Again, this story comes from April of 2020. She is one of at least 42 doctors, nurses, and dentists in Indonesia who had died at the time that this story was written. Native of Jakarta, the Indonesian capital, Dr. Kety had a reputation for being kind and generous, but also for being strict and tenacious in her work. Mama would treat any patient, her daughter said. She would not think twice whether it's a patient with a contagious disease or not. If it's a sick person who needs help, Mama would treat that patient right away. Dr. Margareta, age 29, said that her mother was a powerful influence and that she had followed her example into medicine. I became a doctor because of Mama, she said. I saw how Mama helped other people, how she was respected by other people, and how she was loved by her patients. A friend and fellow doctor, Anita Puspasari, recalled how one patient was confused about whether to undergo a certain medical procedure. Dr. Kety personally took the patient to a doctor at another hospital to get a second opinion. She wanted the patient to have a peace of mind, Dr. Anita said. She helped everybody. Dr. Kety loved to cook and often brought food to the hospital that she had prepared at home. She ordered us, her colleagues, to enjoy her cooking, Dr. Anita said. She was a very pleasant person and kind. We all feel a very huge loss with her passing. Dr. Kety is survived by her husband and 3 children. The obituary of Dr. Kety Herawati Sultana, who died in April of 2020, COVID-19. Okay, it's my pleasure to bring SULFIKAR AMIR back to COVID Calls. Let me introduce him in case you're not familiar with his work. He's not a stranger to COVID Calls. He's an associate professor of Science, Technology, and Society, and a faculty member in the sociology program in the School of Social Sciences at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is the author of The Technological State in Indonesia, the Co-Constitution of High Technology and Authoritarian Politics, and he's also the editor of the Socio-Technical Constitution of Resilience, a new perspective on governing risk and disaster, which appeared in 2018. He's also a filmmaker, and his latest film is titled Healing Fukushima. Sulfikar Amir, welcome back to COVID Calls.
It's good to be back, Scott. How are you?
Doing okay. And I was really eager to get you back on because this is our third time to talk. And as we're putting this archive together, it was important to me to have well, first of all, I'd just like to see you again, but then also just to have your voice one more time to get this perspective from Singapore. It looks like you're facing the same kind of situation we're facing here in South Korea right now. You're in an Omicron wave, it appears.
Yes, Omicron wave is coming to Singapore since early January. So basically, the whole regions of Southeast Asia is now facing the Omicron wave, and Singapore is one of those countries that is seeing a high increase of infection cases. And actually, 2 days ago, we reached a record-breaking number. It was 26,000 cases. It went down slightly yesterday, but then I think today it's going to be a higher number of cases again. So that's very much similar situations that we see in the neighboring countries, including Indonesia and Malaysia. Yeah.
So maybe we can back up a little bit. When we talked a year ago on the anniversary of the Fukushima disaster, and you were part of a great conversation that we did with other colleagues, Japanese colleagues for that. We had our first conversation on COVID calls. I don't know if you remember, it was May 21st, 2020.
Wow.
And so it's been a while. And, at that time, and I think kind of throughout the pandemic, Singapore has taken what can only be described as a very aggressive approach to managing infection. So how has it been over the last year, before the Omicron wave started? What was the situation there in terms of vaccination rates, in terms of public confidence in the health system? How were things looking leading up to January?
Well, we can go back to the time before Delta came to Singapore in I think in July and August last year. The vaccination rate was already high. I mean, back then, I think the coverage of double dose vaccination has reached about 80%. But then when Delta variant entered Singapore, it was quite unexpected in terms of the ability of the variant to spread so quickly and so massively. Singapore government decided to tighten the measures a little bit, but still keep the border open for foreign travelers. Not until in July that the government realized that the situation was worse than they expected. But for the past 2 years, Singapore has been trying to manage the situations by taking a very, very strict actions to manage the pandemic crisis. But when the Delta wave, came, the government realized that it was no longer, doable to go back to the time when a circuit breaker was implemented. So in in September, the Singapore government decided that we're gonna go through this, Delta wave without so much restriction as it used to be in 2020, given the fact that Singapore has reached a high level of vaccination, and that decision come with consequences because it allows people to do social activities every day as usual, although of course there are some restrictions, but it comes with high number of cases, and eventually the wave was inevitable in Singapore, and it caused a massive number of hospitalization. Well, the health infrastructure was overwhelmed during October and November, and then finally, the Delta wave went down by December, and the situation gets stable. But it doesn't take another month when Omicron wave came. But I think the Singapore government already prepared for that. They learned the fact that the Omicron wave was not as severe as Delta. So there's no much changes in terms of social restrictions. There is some form of sort of monitoring, testing, and vaccinations that are ramped up since Delta wave came. And now Omicron wave, I think, has been around for maybe 4 weeks now in Singapore, and the hospitals are slightly overwhelmed at the moment, but not because of severe cases, but more of people who tested positive and asking for medical certificate, because that's the only way they can take a leave from office, right? So a lot of people are going to doctor asking for medical certificate, including students. And this is something that the government say, okay, as long as you tested positive and you can show the result using antigen rapid test, then you should be okay. It should be acceptable. So that's what people do now. I mean, every day people are encouraged to take tests whenever they feel a bit unhealthy. And as a matter of fact, every week I have students tested positive. And today I get 4 students
Really? Wow.
who missed the midterm exam because of that. So yeah, I have to arrange for a makeup midterm for them.
So I love your shirt, and I'm glad you definitely dressed up well for this conversation, and I appreciate that. Talk to me a little bit about Singapore's pathway to vaccination, because countries like Australia and where I'm in South Korea were quite a bit slower, I think, than Singapore in getting hold of a vaccine. Was it produced there domestically? Were you able to purchase a supply in the open market? And when were people vaccinated?
Okay, so about the T-shirt, this is my vaccine certificate, so I don't have to bring any paper form to go to the malls and other places. So yeah, well, Singapore is one of the countries with the highest level of vaccination, and of course, thanks to the government's successful attempt to secure supplies from global manufacturers of vaccine, including Moderna, Pfizer, BioNTech, and etc. So there are 2 major COVID-19 vaccines that have been used in Singapore, Pfizer and Moderna. And as a matter of fact, I think back in July 2020, the government, Singapore government's own company called Temasek Holdings managed to purchase share of BioNTech. And I think they inked an agreement last year to open a manufacturing facility in Singapore by 2023. So they're going to produce, BioNTech vaccines starting next year. So in terms of supply, Singapore has no problem at all. And at the moment, the vaccination rate in Singapore has reached 97% of the population, and I think for booster, it has reached almost 60%.
Mhm.
So it's very aggressive in terms of vaccination, and this is because the Singapore government believe that vaccination is the way to pass through this pandemic. So yeah.
97%. I think that must be the highest in the world.
Yeah, one of the highest in the world. But of course, you have to consider the size of the population is quite small, 5.8 million. So, yeah,
Still.
I think it's less than the people in New York.
Still, there's no grouping of 5.8 million people anywhere in the world with that high of a rate. I can't imagine. Are you very close to the top, as you said? One of the issues we talked about way back in 2020 was the difficulty at that time of the unevenness of the infection rate and problem of outbreak, particularly among guest workers in Singapore,
Yes.
and that made international news pretty early in the pandemic. Bring us up to date on that. That was all resolved in 2020. Have there been continuing issues related to non-citizens?
Well, there's been some improvement that the government agency has made for the accommodations of migrant workers. Although, of course, uh, uh, the risk of infection is relatively, still high among migrant workers because of their living condition. But compared to what happened in 2020, I think we have to appreciate what the government has done to improve the facility. And I guess the infection risk in Singapore is no longer concentrated among migrant workers. Basically, everyone, all over Singapore, people who go to work, people who go to school, people who go to restaurants, and etc. And the Singapore government seems to have no interest in going back to tighten the social restrictions. And as a matter of fact, they have been thinking of easing the restrictions next month, depending on the situation with the Omicron wave. Once the Omicron wave, wanes, I think the government is gonna do it. And this has also happened with the borders. So far, there's no strict, entrance for people who comes from overseas. And before Omicron, actually, Singapore has arranged what they call vaccinated travel lane with 20 countries. So
Right.
people can come here from that group of countries that have a VTL agreement with Singapore without having to do a quarantine. They just have to do test for 3 days, and if they pass it, and that's it. They can do whatever they want. They can walk outside and yeah, and enjoy the city. So and Singapore is going to expand this a group of VTL next month, and there is also a plan to completely open the border, regardless of the origins of travelers. So they just focus on the individuals. So they are only looking at the vaccination status, whether they come from the United States, whether they come from Australia, from China, from Australia. So they don't really see that. What they want to see is the vaccination history of that person.
Let me just remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to SULFIKAR AMIR today and getting an update on the COVID situation in Singapore. So one of the other things that South Korea and Singapore share is this intense commitment of the government to showcase technology. And I mean, most countries do that, but I think in Singapore and South Korea, they sort of take it to the next level, as evidenced by what you were telling me a moment ago about the early investment in pharmaceutical manufacturing, which will now render 2023 pharmaceutical manufacturing there in Singapore. Talk to me a little bit about that, if you would, the sort of rhetoric around science and technology and how that's worked in Singapore, because in South Korea, it's been a point of major pride. Even though getting the vaccine here was slow, compared to other countries, the testing, track, trace technology, the ability of the health system to manage things pretty well, has been something that the government has really wanted to export, basically, put forward as a sort of a point of national pride. I wonder if it's similar there in Singapore. I mean, you're a close student of science, technology, and society. So is this some kind of a turning point for technology in Singapore?
Yeah, I think the pandemic provides an opportunity for researchers and innovators to develop devices and products that can help people to live their life, relatively normal. And one example is the use of this mobile application called Trace Together, which also has uh, another versions that is put into a gadget called Trace Together token. This is basically a tool for tracing if someone who close to you, tested positive, and you will be asked to do testing as well, right? And whenever you enter a facility, you have to scan, etc. So basic technology, which I believe, almost all countries in the world are doing the same, right? But I think when it comes to the opportunity to produce vaccines, that's a different story, because this is a kind of industry that cannot be built overnight, right? You cannot just bring, for example, AstraZeneca technology and put it somewhere in a country that has no existing infrastructure to produce vaccines, not to mention manpower and researchers, and as well as experts who can work together to support the production of these vaccines. And that's exactly what we see here in Singapore when the government managed to invest money in BioNTech and to bring BioNTech technology here in Singapore and develop the manufacture facility, which I heard is fully automated. So because of lack of manpower, of course. And I think it's now under construction, and they're gonna start producing vaccines, by next year. And this is possible because Singapore has invested a lot of money to develop a biotech, infrastructures. One example that has been sort of the hallmark of Singapore biotech capacity is the Biopolis, which is sort of a complex of techno-scientific research and institution that attract many researchers around the world to come here and to produce innovations in medicine, in biotechnology related products, and etc. And I think it is these infrastructures that provides an environment for products such as BioNTech vaccine to be easily adopted and to be easily produced because of the availability of resources and manpower, as well as institutions. Not to mention, of course, capital that that of course appear to be very attractive for companies like BioNTech. So I think it's a win-win solution for BioNTech and for Singapore government to work together to produce vaccines, and making Singapore as the hub for vaccine production, at least in Southeast Asia, if not in Asia.
So if you could bring me up to date a little bit on some of the neighboring countries there, particularly Indonesia. I mean, I read those statistics at the beginning. Of course, Indonesia is an enormous country with vast population, so totally different from Singapore, but you know the country well. What's happening there?
Well, Indonesia is completely different story. Of course, they're now also facing Omicron wave. But the situation was not as bad as when Delta wave was happening back in June and July. I happened to be in Indonesia during the second wave of Delta, and I see with my own eyes how the situation was so grim, so dark. Every day, 2,000 people die because of COVID-19, and not to mention the unreported cases of and excess death that is not included in the government report, right? But I think for Omicron wave, the situation is slightly different because the government was prepared, and the vaccination rate was much higher than when Delta wave happened. What we see is the hospitalization rate that is much lower compared to the previous wave of Delta back in June and July. So the situation was relatively stable, although the government has to tighten some of the restrictions in several parts of the countries, including in a number of cities in Java, where that had become the epicenter of Omicron spread. But overall, I think Indonesia is doing okay with the current situation, and they already started giving a booster shot, especially to vulnerable populations such as older people and those with comorbid disease. So so I think the situation is relatively manageable. That what we see in Indonesia.
And what about the government there, in terms of political strife and keeping a handle on any kind of criticism that might have been surfacing of the government there? I mean, was there much by way of dissent in terms of the way the government in Indonesia was managing the pandemic, or not really?
I think for the current situation, we have to appreciate what the government is doing in responding to the Omicron wave. The Ministry of Health is doing a wonderful job, I think, in providing, in ramping up healthcare facility, especially in vulnerable areas such as in Jakarta, in Surabaya, Bandung, etc. So the critiques that comes from people who think the government is not doing a good job is not so much, very, I would say, very harsh compared to the what happened last year. And I think the government has learned, their lesson. The Delta wave really taught a very hard lesson to Indonesian government. And now they accepted the fact that they don't want to repeat the same mistake over and over after mishandling the pandemic for 1.5 years. So now the government is ramping up healthcare facility, boosting up the vaccination rates, and of course giving more positive communications to the people, and showing a sense of crisis that did not happen before. So I think this is something that we should applaud, the Indonesian government.
And you were talking about the openness once again to travel in Singapore. So if there was restrictions on movement back and forth between Indonesia and Singapore for some time.
Yeah, actually, before Omicron, there was a VTL uh, uh, from Singapore, no, from Indonesia to Singapore. So Singapore, accept people who travel from Indonesia without having to do the quarantine. But now the VTL agreement was on hold for the moment. But there's been the discussions of opening up the borders fully for people in two countries. And actually, last week, the Bali airport was already reopened, and there's a first Singapore airline flight that flew to Bali last week with Singapore tourists. I'm not sure whether it's the consequences of that, but so far I don't hear any problem with that. I mean, the number of infection cases in Bali is relatively stable. So yeah, hopefully it continues that way.
I'll just remind folks I'm talking with Sulfikar Amir today on COVID calls, and let me just change topics a little bit. So you're a filmmaker, and whenever we talk, I have to get an update from you about how your filmmaker eyes are seeing and what your filmmaker brain is thinking right now. And I'm curious, you made films about Fukushima, and they're great films, and the film Healing Fukushima, one of the things I like, and everybody should watch that film, and one of the things that I like so much about it, and we've talked about this before, is your use of silence, your use of emptiness, your attention to places that are scary because they're empty and you feel like they shouldn't be. And I've thought about those images a lot with COVID, and the difficulty that filmmakers, I think, are going to have in sort of rendering the different modes of COVID, which seem to run between full emergency departments and overtaxed healthcare, and then on one side, and then silence and emptiness, empty spaces on the other. But I can't turn that into a film. That's your job. So I wonder if you don't mind talking a little bit about it, have you been thinking about COVID from the perspective of the visual?
Well, thanks, Scott, for bringing this up. I always appreciate, how you describe my film and how you, praise what I did in that film. Uh, well, it occurred to me to produce another documentary that illustrate the impact of pandemic, especially on urban communities. It will be, I think, interesting to show how people were deeply affected by the pandemic, right? Um, but of course, the situation does not allow me to do that at the moment. So, but I can see that. I guess what is interesting will be to make another film that tells a story after the pandemic. There's a bunch of documentary films that you can watch about COVID-19, and then there's a number of really, really fascinating films on Netflix, on Disney Plus, on Amazon Prime, and etc. That focus on that topic, right? But what is I think what we need to see is how do people feel, after going through 2 and now 3 years of pandemic.
Hmm.
Well, are they still feeling anxiety, or and how they think about what in the future holds? I think this is we are now living in a time of uncertainties, and a lot of things can happen. And of course, yesterday Russia sent troops to Ukraine, right? And that creates another humanity crisis in the world, and we don't know the repercussions of that action, right? And I think similar to pandemic. I mean, last year we were so optimistic that the vaccines will end it,
Yeah.
but then after we reach a high level of vaccinations, and we see that it doesn't work as we expected.
Yeah.
The coronavirus is still around us. So how do we live our life in this kind of uncertainties, regardless our knowledge, our science institutions, our technological capability, and so on? How will we face and deal with a level of uncertainty that we have a limited ability to respond to it? And yeah, I think for me that question is more disturbing, and we need to answer that. Whether we have a good answer or not remain to be seen, right? But I
Yeah. I
think
don't.
it's
Yeah.
interesting to explore.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I don't want you to give away your trade secrets, but I mean, I am curious, like, who do you want to talk to about that? I mean, I find that question pretty compelling too, to ask people maybe to go beyond what was your experience of COVID, but the question which you're putting forward, which is, how do you plan to live now? That's a really good question. Who do you want to ask?
I think the first group of people that have to be asked that questions are those who have the power to control our life, right? I want to see how they view this problem. I want to see what perspective they are going to use to ensure us that we're going to be okay.
Hmm.
So we're talking about policymakers, talking about politicians, scientific experts, and the likes that have better ability to handle the uncertain futures of our life, and then we bring it to the reality of life by asking ordinary people what they expect, how they will respond to it, and how they think about their life in the future. So I think it will be interesting to compare and to see maybe a big gap between these two group of people, right? So
Yeah, I think so. You'll see that gap. Yeah, and also, thinking what we were talking about before, country like Singapore, or again maybe South Korea, where I imagine if you talk to top policymakers and people who are in science policy, they're going to point to COVID as a turning point in their careers, and as a moment in which they had to come up with fresh thinking about health service, about some issues which maybe they didn't want to deal with, like issues around
yeah,
healthcare provision for guest workers, as we talked about before. But I don't think I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think it's going to be a very different situation in the United States. I mean, the United States very well too, but I mean, Singapore and the US are going to come out of this pandemic, even in the science bureaucracy, with very different lessons, I think.
that's right. That's right. That is absolutely true, and that makes me always grateful for living in a country where the authority pay attention, and and always try to protect their citizens, right? And of course, as an STS scholar, we have a job to criticize scientists and the science institutions. But at the same time, we have to appreciate if that science is used to protect citizens. And
Sure.
this is the point where we have to draw a line between how to criticize science as a powerful institutions that may harm the people, right? From the fact that science has been used to to make us more aware of our limited knowledge. So I think we're talking about the ability of science institutions and of course the government to be more reflective and use that knowledge in a wiser way, so that so that everyone is protected. Of course, we have to recognize that even the most brilliant scientists and the most advanced, scientific knowledge have limitations in predicting the future, has limitations in fully protect, everyone. But I guess, yeah, I think it depends on the political, the political conditions that allow science to be more meaningful and more beneficial for people. Well, countries like United States that has high reputations and high capability in scientific research, of course, have the advantage of protecting their citizens in using that knowledge, so that the pandemic could be ended immediately. But what we see is basically sort of the opposite of the situation.
Right.
So yeah.
So we're almost up on time, but there was one more issue I wanted to get to, and that is your plans to get back to Japan. If you have any time, you and I always talk about this. I mean,
Yes.
I moved to South Korea, and under ordinary conditions, I would have already been there 3 or 4 times in this last year to see friends and to do work, and I haven't been at all.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to going to Japan whenever the border is open. I just book my flight and boom.
What are they doing? They're not going to open. They're being their approach to the border has been vexing to me. I haven't understood it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think they're going back to the pre-Meiji era. The whole country.
Well, I'm definitely not getting in then.
Completely isolated from the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I hope we get a chance sometime soon to get
too.
back there. I mean, you have ongoing research sites there. You need to get back.
Of course, yes. Yeah, I have unfinished business in Tokyo.
Yeah. Well, just want to take a moment to thank you for your work and also for coming on COVID Calls 3 times over the run of this project. It's meant a lot to me, and it's great to have your perspective from Singapore there. And so I hope we'll keep in touch. I'm sure we will be in contact soon. And I just want to also remind everybody you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can catch COVID Calls. Right now, we're doing COVID Calls all different hours because we're moving towards March 16th, which will culminate the COVID Calls project. And so just follow my Twitter at US of Disaster for updates. Sulfikar, take care of yourself and keep well. And thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me here, Scott. Stay safe.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls.
Bye.